Hi, it's Wallace, and I wanted to make another video to tell you a little bit more about my journey from Protestantism to Catholicism. And if you watched my other video, you know I was a Protestant for 35 years, and recently, about a little over a year ago, I became a Catholic. And I wanted to share a little bit about why, a little more in depth about why I made that decision. And I think if you went down the same path that I did, that you would come to the same conclusion that I did. So a little bit backstory is, I was a Protestant for 35 years, and I was the last church I was going to. The pastor, great guy, I love the guy, but we vehemently disagreed about the rapture, which I think is really a heretical teaching, and maybe I'll make another video about that sometime, of why I think that's such a dangerous teaching, but that's not for this time. So when I stopped going to church, I went on a study, and I started reading the first century authors of Christianity. And these are the people that came, right after the apostles. And it was a very eye-opening experience, to say the least. And what I discovered, and I would encourage you to read some of these people, and what they thought, what their thinking was at the time. The first thing that jumped right out at me was that they believed in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. So, and for this video, I think I'll call it, for my Protestant brothers, communion and not Eucharist. So they believed in the real presence of God, of Jesus, in the communion. And I've started with Ignatius. I'm reading here Ignatius of Antioch, and I just want to read one thing, and you could look all these up too, and you'll find the same thing I found out. So Ignatius said, "I have no taste for the corruptible food. I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ. And for drink, I desire the blood, which is love incorruptible." And that's 110 AD. That's, right after the apostles. Some of the other ones, Justin the Martyr, 100 to 165. Tertullian, 155. Origen, 185. Clement, 150. And what became apparent to me, two things really, is that number one, they believed in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And that's what kind of really stuck out to me. And the other thing was that every single time they described what to do when Christians gathered was to take communion, and to break the bread and drink the wine. And that was the centerpiece of their belief. And when being a Protestant, so I was always taught that the communion was just a symbol. It wasn't really the presence of Jesus, and it was just like I blindly, kind of, now that I'm thinking about it, accepted that, just as like, okay, I guess that's settled, in the Word. But there was never a Bible study or a teaching or anything of why to back up that teaching, right? Where now that I'm looking at it, the overwhelming evidence is to the contrary. The overwhelming evidence is that really Jesus is present in the elements of communion. And the early church fathers back that up. And I encourage you to read them and read what they say about this matter. And when you think about it, so, the New Testament mirrors the Old Testament. Okay, so in the Old Testament, this the Passover, when they took the lamb, the spotless lamb, and they slaughtered it and sprinkled its blood in the Holy of Holies, what did they do with the lamb? They ate the flesh. They were told that they had to eat the flesh of the lamb. And so it makes sense that the New Testament mirrors the Old Testament teaching of eating the flesh of the sacrificed lamb. So doing more and more study about this, and one thing that really bothered me about the Protestant church always was their nonchalant treating of communion. In most Protestant churches, it's like once a month, and it's like maybe a 5 or 10 minute thing, during the service or something like that. Is never the centerpiece I've never been to a Protestant service where it's the centerpiece. The centerpiece is always the teaching or the music, either one. But communion is never the centerpiece. And it's very clear when you read the first century, authors, or these people that came right after the apostles, that it was always the centerpiece of their worship service. So the second thing, now that this was an eye-opening experience to me, I started to research this, and it brought me to, in the New Testament, John chapter 6, when Jesus doubles down about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. So setting the stage on that was, right after Jesus feeds the 5,000, and the analogy is he broke the bread, he they took the loaves up, and there was 6 loaves, and he broke it and passed it out, which is the mirror of really the Last Supper. But in John chapter 6, so the story was, okay, so then he did that, and then he left and went on the other side of the lake, and the people followed him. And then in later on in the chapter, Jesus starts talking about him being the bread of life, and whoever eats this flesh and drinks this blood will have everlasting life. And it says here, and I'm just reading this, the Jews were upset and said, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So if this was just a symbol, Jesus had a perfectly good time right there to say, well, I wasn't really talking about eating my flesh. I was just saying that it's a symbol of my flesh. But no, what he does then, and you can read this, John chapter 6, it's about from verse 50 on, he doubles down on this, and he uses a verb that's a very kind of funny verb to use for eating, which is trogo. And trogo is, it's a more, it's even, it's crunching and munching, it's chewing. It's not just like, oh, come over to eat. I would say to you, come over to my house, you want to have something to eat? And I would say, like, come over, if I use the verb trogo, I would say, come over to my house to chew and to gnaw. It's a verb that's used a lot for animals when they're grazing and gnawing and chewing. It's so instead of Jesus backing off on this teaching in John chapter 6, he uses a very, very strong word for eating, which is chewing. And so you have to like chew his flesh. And what happened is, when you read the other chapter, most of the people departed. They said, this teaching is too hard for us. This is like cannibalism, this teaching, and many departed from him. And that's what happened today too. Many people that are hearing this video will say, this teaching is too hard for us. I can't imagine this. So, but read John chapter 6, and with that, when he says eat, put that word trogo in there, chew and to munch, and see where it brings you. And it's unmistakably to me that he wasn't talking about, this is not an analogy or a symbol or anything like that. He was actually talking about eating his flesh. And then, going on with this theme, now that I was doing this kind of study about the real presence in the communion, is that I was thinking, God has always had some kind of physical presence in this world. First, he was in the Ark of the Covenant, okay, so, and he had his presence there. The second one, he was in the Holy of Holies, God has his presence there. So where is God's presence now? Where is he? He's always had a presence, a physical presence somewhere in the earth. And I would argue that it's in the communion or in the Eucharist now that God is present still in this earth, because he would always have to have a physical presence here. And going on with that theme, in the Bible, I could find 3 places that encountering God would cause death to a human being. The number one was touching the ark. You couldn't touch the ark. The ark was first of all, they had to cover the ark in order that nobody could look upon it. I don't know what would happen then, but there was a guy, Uzzah, who they put an ark on the oxen cart, which they shouldn't have done anyway. They were supposed to carry it, but they put it on an oxen cart. I guess they got tired of carrying it. So it was almost falling, and he touched it, and he died, because you cannot touch things of God in being in our state of sin that we are. So that was the first thing. You couldn't touch the ark, or that would cause death. The second place that would cause death, encountering God on this earth, would be going into the Holy of Holies, okay, in an unworthy manner. So only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. Anybody else that would go in there would die. And actually, when the high priest went in the Holy of Holies, there was smoke in there. It says that there was smoke in there so that the high priest couldn't see the presence of God, because it's too strong for a human being. And the third place is, and when you think about this, it's taking communion in an unworthy manner. And Paul says in, 1 Corinthians 11, and when he talks about taking communion in an unworthy manner, he said, some have even, and a number of you have even died from doing that. So when you think about that, if this was just a symbol, how could you die from taking communion in an unworthy manner if it's just a symbol and it's not the real presence of God? And those are the three things. And all those, the other two things, and the third thing is communion in an unworthy manner. Those are the things of God that cause death to human beings on this earth. You see, the presence of God is so strong when it's on the earth that God has to hide himself. He has to hide himself in the ark, and it has to be covered. He has to hide himself with smoke, and he has to hide himself in communion, in the bread and in the wine. He's hiding himself there because it would be too much for us to gaze upon him or to take communion when it was when it was not hidden. And when you think about this, all this stuff put together, and what God desires of us, he wants to be intimate with us. And many years ago, I gave my will and my life over to the care of Jesus Christ. I put my life in his hands and gave, whatever the Protestant thing was, gave my heart to the Lord. But God not only wants us to be, intimate with our spirit, he wants to be physically intimate with us. And that's why there's unrefutable evidence that the body and blood of Jesus is in the water, is in the the bread and the wine in communion, because he wants to be intimate with you in the most intimate of way, that is taking his body inside of your body. So I would really encourage you to, if you are fearless, and like I said before, you have to be fearless to do this and have to have an open mind to do the study that I did, and just look up these things. And there's plenty of books you can get about it and stuff like that. But the early church fathers, those are tremendous, eye-opening accounts of what Christianity was like, in the early church. So God bless you on your journey. I hope you find the peace and the happiness that I have found in the Catholic Church. It's not perfect, and I got a lot of comments on my other video how corrupt the church is, and I know it's corrupt, because it's of men, but there is a core of believers. There is a core of people that are not corrupt. We're all sinners, that's for sure, but aren't corrupted to the point where, we're just trying to do the best we can. So God bless you on your journey, and I hope that you find the same thing that I find.